most scientists go through conventional training. They go through 20 years of school. Most scientists will never hear anything about psychic phenomena in their academic training, except maybe they'll hear about it and say, well, you can dismiss that because it's been proven to be all delusion and fraud. And that's all they know. So if somebody then claims that there is evidence for this, they will, of course, think that that's nonsense because they went through this training and they never heard anything about it. Or they heard worse, that there's something there, but it was all denied. So this has led within an orthodox science, within mainstream science, to the notion that people who believe in psychic phenomena are stupid. And what they mean by that is that they are not trained in the principles of science to be able to understand why such phenomena can't be true. So I call this the stupidity hypothesis. It's a testable hypothesis because what it says is, if you look at the number of years of education that somebody has, there should be a negative correlation with the degree of belief in psychic phenomena. The more educated you are, the less you would believe. And this is the assertion that many skeptics will say. In fact, the National Science Foundation says this, essentially. They bemoan the fact of science education being so poor in the United States, and this is why people believe in lots of nonsense. Well, some of that is true. People are not very well educated in science, but they include in the mix psychic phenomena as an example of one of the crazy things that people believe because they're stupid. If you look at the actual data, you look at the survey data, you partition it by the number of years of education versus belief in things like ESP. It is not a negative correlation. And in fact, it's a significant positive correlation. What does that mean? That means that the more educated you are, the more likely you are going to believe in psychic phenomena. So in other words, you can test the stupidity hypothesis and it fails. When you do the same sort of analysis and you do surveys for college professors, what percentage of college professors believe in things psychic? 60 to 70%. Well, they're not stupid. So the ignorance spin that is put on this is absolutely not true. So there needs to be other ways of understanding, well, then what are they believing in? Why do they believe in this stuff? Mainstream science says it couldn't possibly exist, but it's based on a false premise that it couldn't exist. Why do they believe? Most people believe in something even when science says it can't be so because of their own experience, their personal experience. And so you can kind of make a guess that people who are not very well educated can be deluded into believing things, even though science says you shouldn't believe it, because they don't have the critical thinking apparatus in order to figure out what might be coincidence and what might be wishful thinking and so on. But that is not the case when you have highly sophisticated psychologists, for example, or other kinds of scientists who spend their lives critically thinking about things. If you start denying your own experience, that's like one step in the nut house. You can't deny your own experience. So scientists, like many people, will become schizophrenic. They have personal, private beliefs that are developed because of their experience, but they don't talk about it in public. Because in public, at least within the academic world, you're not supposed to talk about it. And this is one of the few areas in academia where this taboo is not only strong, but has persisted for at least a century, probably more than a century. I know many, many academic colleagues. These are distinguished people in their fields, in psychology, cognitive neuroscience, the basic neurosciences, physics, and so on, who privately are very, very interested in these phenomena, psi phenomena. Some of them are doing their own experiments. Some of them are getting successful results in their experiments. Well, why aren't we hearing about it? Because the culture in the academic world says you cannot talk about it. So we're living in the parable of the emperor's new clothes. It's something that everybody knows, but cannot speak about it. So just from a purely sociological point of view, this is so interesting. You have this completely schizophrenic split between experiences which happen repeatedly and have throughout time and to all kinds of people, including college professors, and then you have to officially deny it. So because I've noticed in the last decade or so that the number of academics that are interested in these topics but have been quiet is getting larger and larger. And I'm not exactly sure why. The times have changed. There's new openness to new ideas. Maybe because the idea of mind-body connections is no longer considered a lunatic fringe, but is mainstream, that people are more open to new ideas. So this is like a new ancient idea that now it's becoming not quite, you still can't quite be public about it, but the number of people has grown, so there's a restlessness which is occurring. And I'm the lightning rod for it. I get contacted by these people all the time and telling me their secret interest in it. And I say, well, did you know that so-and-so in the same department where you are is interested in this? And they say, really? I never knew. And then they start collaborating. And there's an invisible college that's beginning to evolve of its own accord. So I'm projecting that within 5 or 10 years, perhaps, that the invisible college will grow so large and the pressure will be so large that the taboo will be addressed. I mean, even at this point, the taboo is so strong, you're not even supposed to talk about the taboo. It's like a highly secret government project where the fact of the existence of the project is secret. Well, the taboo is secret. No one's supposed to talk about it. Once the taboo is addressed, that's the first stage in making it dissolve. And at that point, you will find an enormous amount of interest in studying these things within mainstream science. And I've known this has been the case for at least 20 years. 20 years ago, I would give a talk to a group of technical people and scientists. And being out of that culture, at the very beginning, I'll say something like, you know, they're all expectantly waiting to hear what I'm going to talk about. And I'll say, I know what you're thinking. And of course, they all laugh. And what you're thinking is, why am I talking to a scientific and technical audience about something which you only know from the entertainment world? Psychic phenomena, after all. And the reason I'm talking to you about it is because when you look around, you'll find that it's standing room only. And this is among scientists and technical people in a technical environment. Well, why is it standing room only? Because everybody's interested in it. Most people in a positive direction, some in a negative, but they're still interested. What other area of science do we know where there's an enormous amount of interest and nobody doing anything about it? So I say at the end of the talk, if there was funding, there's federal funding, funding from your company or wherever it happens to be, that allowed you to do this without risk to your career, how many of you would like to do this research by raising your hand? Almost everybody. I mean, so I present the issue back to them saying, well, why am I different? The only thing that makes me different from you is that I was willing to take a risk. Because I'm interested just like you are, except that, you know, I'm willing to say, well, it seems more interesting to me than things like having a very secure career, because ultimately our lives last that long, and, you know, do something interesting. That's my philosophy. So that's part of the way that I see what is happening in terms of this taboo, which has persisted and needs to break.
Now, there's something that people always want to know, ask us, and they say, so I'm going to ask you. They say, okay, all this quantum stuff is nice, but what's the payoff? What does it mean in my life? What does it mean me personally? What does it mean for humanity? What does it mean to society? How does any of this stuff happening with little subatomic quarks, what's the payoff? Why should I care about any of this?
Well, my father studied philosophy for many years, and I never got it. I never understood why would anybody care about things like basic assumptions about the world. And now I understand it a lot better, partly because I'm older and able to reflect back on my life and history. But the reason that philosophy is important is because its purpose is to look at assumptions about who and what we think we are, about the way the world works, and so on. So from a science point of view, the philosophy focuses then now on two different kinds of worldviews, a worldview of the classical type and of the quantum type. I fully expect later there will be something that is beyond the quantum, but just right now we can compare these two. From the classical side, we are mechanistic things. We are like little robots. And robots, we can build them, we can throw them away, it doesn't matter. In addition, robots don't have any conscious experience. It's like asking whether your computer has a conscious life. Most people think that's probably not the case. So you can throw it away, turn it off, it doesn't matter. Well, what if the assumption was false? What if that is actually not true, that there's some other way of thinking about the way the world is? Up until 100 years ago, we didn't have any reason to imagine that there would be another way. But because of the advent of quantum mechanics, which was largely driven by mysteries about the nature of light, that after following that track for many years, many of the physicists who developed quantum mechanics and think about it have been forced to become philosophers because they're forced to look very carefully at the assumptions that we make about the kind of world that we live in. And what's really interesting is that the physicist philosophers have moved in the direction of holism because that's what the physics says. Living in a holistic environment is very, very different than living in a robot world. And the consequences of that are still not fully worked out, but it will have a very strong impact in the next couple of decades in terms of how we think about ourselves. So when we think about holism, sometimes we say, well, it's like ecology. 30 years ago, ecology wasn't even a word, and it means that there is an interdependence within the world. But we're talking about something which goes way beyond ecology. It's not simply interdependence, but an interpenetration, a coexistence of things at a very deep scale, not just among living things, but everything. Just as ecology has changed our way about how we think about the world, like the idea of sustainability in the world, that's new. What will the world be like when we have a notion of sustainability of thought and sustainability of ourselves and in the future and in the past? We don't know yet what that's going to be like, but it'll be very interesting to see it develop.
Now, when you say it seems to be a correlation, I mean, statistically, what's the deviation from randomness that someone focusing on having more ones would happen? Is it like 2-to-1 randomness, or is it a 10 billion to 1, or?
Well, the last analysis that I did, which looked at all of these experiments, the final analysis is 50,000 to 1. The odds against chance are 50,000 to 1 that the behavior of the random number generators would go in the direction that they did, that were consistent with what intention was wishing them to do.
Now, what about the people who they criticize? They say, well, that's just statistics. That doesn't really prove anything about the mind-matter interaction. How would you respond to that?
All of science now, all of empirical science is based on statistical analyses because nothing ever works the same way twice. And this is especially true when it comes to human behavior. I mean, so an example is, why are people interested in sports just obsessed with statistics? Because human behavior is variable. So when we look at a good baseball player and they have say a 400 hitting average, that's incredible. But all it means is 40% of the time they'll get a base hit. So why do we say, well, so what? They're not getting 100% of the time. We understand that some forms of human behavior are simply difficult to repeat, even among world-class athletes. Here we're dealing with something that's much more subtle. We're dealing with a direct mind-matter interaction. And so you're not going to see it 100% of the time. And as soon as that's the case, you have to deal with statistics. Statistical arguments are used everywhere in science. And I understand that if you're not a fan of mathematics and you don't trust statistics, maybe think about baseball and think about why statistics are so important in sports. And it's purely because of the uncertainty in sports.
Excellent. So do you have any theories on the mechanism that makes when someone's sitting there with their intention going, I want more ones than zeros? Do you have any? Because, is it just magic? Is it just spookiness? Or do you have some sort of theory as to why someone's intention, which seems to be an internal, intangible thing, can affect a random event?
The way I think about what's happening with in the random number generators or in intention in general? Why does intention leak out and get outside my head somehow? I think about it as the relationship between mind and matter. What is that relationship? Well, one way of thinking of it is we take a ribbon, and on the outside of the ribbon we write the word mind, and the inside of the ribbon we write the word matter. So they're tightly correlated. And in fact, we know that. If you look at an EEG or you look at a functional MRI picture of the brain, what's going on inside the head is tightly coupled to what our subjective experience is like. So it's like this ribbon. If you shake the ribbon, the mind and matter will kind of shake together. So they're related in some strong way. But since they're two sides of the ribbon, it's not the same thing. They're two sides, and they can't interpenetrate somehow. So where does the mind and matter connect? So I would say all that you need to do is imagine that the ribbon that we've been looking at was slightly misconceived. It actually is not a ribbon. It's a ribbon where somebody put a half twist in it and reconnected it, and it makes it a Mobius strip. So now if you're looking at the matter side and you're saying, well, how in the world can it connect to mind? And you keep tracing along this thing and you find suddenly you were working on matter, but you've ended up on the mind side. Well, why is that? It's because a Mobius strip has one side. And it looks like a ribbon from a distance that has two distinct sides, but it really isn't. It's the same thing. And it looks different depending on your perspective. So when my mind is thinking about a random number generator, the mind and matter on the subjective side are actually the same thing. And so I think about a certain way, and it is expressed in a hunk of matter because the hunk of matter actually has some mind in it as well. But we don't see that. We see our own mind very clearly because of our perspective on it. We don't see that there's any mind stuff in a random number generator, but it's there.
So how a realization that there's that it's a Mobius strip. What impact do you think that has on people, cities, countries, nations, planets? Is there some sort of scaling factor on that whole thing? Because again, people are still saying like all this stuff is great, Mobius strips, that's wonderful, but I'm still living in the world I'm living in, and trying to get a kind of a big picture of what does this really mean? Because when they first came up with the quantum stuff, it was like, what does this really mean? And 100 years later, we're still asking that question and uncovering it. So
right.
I'm just sort of asking it again.
Well, one implication of this is that people might think, well, if my wishes really can push the world around, then how come I can't win the lottery? How come my wishes don't stop war? How come all kinds of things don't occur? And part of the answer is that each individual is a really small drop in the ocean. And so while our intentions do go out, and we see these things in the laboratory because we're working typically with an individual and one device. And we by design exclude the rest of the world as much as we can, although you can't really do that. That's the design of the experiment. But when you're dealing with the universe at large, and my intention does go out, it ripples out and affects the entire universe, most of the universe doesn't care. It doesn't want to respond. It's off doing its own thing. So from a perspective of thinking about everything as having some form of intentional goal, some kind of wish, whether it's an electron or human or anything, it has some kind of a push out into the world. It's all happening at once. It's all mixing together. And you need to have an enormously strong push in order for that ripple to be felt by anything, unless you happen to be predisposed towards it. So, for example, in a case of an individual and a random number generator, I specifically focus them on that device. And I look at the device at very specific times, and I know what I'm looking for. And we see these small effects. They're there, but they're small. You can say then, well, what would happen if we had 1 billion people all doing the same task, with all focusing in on something, a random number generator or person or anything? Would you get a larger effect? And the answer is probably, but the form of intention would have to be extremely coherent in order for it to have an impact. And the reason is that you imagine that intention is a wave-like structure. If you have more than one of those waves, then the two waves can interfere. They can destroy themselves if they happen to interfere in the wrong way. So if you have a billion people thinking the same way, the same time, in the same manner, I imagine that you would end up with a very large effect, even in random number generators, which are just basically hunks of physical stuff that's getting pushed around.
Does that prove that random effects matter?
Proof is not a word that is used in science. We can show evidence for. We can create a certain degree of confidence that an effect is what it appears to be. We can make measurements. So what we can say is that we have high confidence at this point that the nature of randomness changes when large-scale world events occur. It's not clear what it proves yet, because it's not even entirely clear what the proof would be of, other than somehow mind and matter are connected, or reflect each other is probably a better way of putting it. Well, I think the mathematics for chaos theory and complexity theory are very solid. Is it a new wacky idea? All new ideas are wacky until they become accepted, and then suddenly they become conservative and orthodox. So, of course, in the beginning of every new application, or especially any idea that is coming off from the side, will be perceived as wacky. And then somebody will get a Nobel Prize and it's not wacky anymore. Which is not to say that all new ideas are equally valid, because some of the wacky ideas coming in are in fact quite wacky. And it's only through the passage of time and the value of science, which is to continually confirm that the idea is true or not, where we begin to get a sense of what is likely to be true versus what is likely to be a fantasy.